everyone. Welcome to the podcast Leaders of Impact. This is a series where I speak with leaders who have created meaningful impact through their work and explore not just what they have built, but how they think, lead, and evolve through the journey. I'm really pleased to have Christine with me today. Christine brings a fascinating combination of military leadership, aerospace engineering, safety critical systems, and sustainable aviation. But beyond the technical and operational side, one of the areas I'm especially looking forward to explore today is leadership, authority, and how people experience and perceive leadership in complex environments. Christine, wonderful to have you here.
Thank you for having me, Vikram. Thank you for the introduction.
Lovely. So, Christine, you worked across multiple industries, from military background to aerospace and now to sustainability. Maybe just for the sake of our listeners, if you can give a quick overview of journey so that people can know more about you.
Yeah, of course. So, as you say, my career started out in the military. I fell in love with flying as a member of the Air Training Corps, which is a cadet organisation in the UK. It's a wonderful organisation for giving kids opportunities. And it also opened my eyes to opportunities to work within the military. From that, I learned about how you could be an engineer as well as a pilot within the Air Force. And that was something that I set my sights on, and I was fortunate enough to be awarded a scholarship to continue my studies through school and into university before joining the RAF. And what the RAF gave me was really foundational training in leadership, first and foremost, before indeed training me to be a specialist engineer. So I always took that with me through my career journey, that I was sort of a leader and a supporter of people first. And then I have my technical specialism on top of that. And I spent nearly 22 years in the Air Force, but I had the chance to work in lots of different parts of the organization, as you alluded to in your introduction there. So whilst it was a long time in one organization, I certainly took a very broad pathway and did lots of different things, and from each of those different experiences, I was able to learn and grow. The way that the military is structured is in your early tours, you're exposed to leadership responsibilities very early, but you're also given a support structure, kind of like it wasn't called mentoring, but you're surrounded by very experienced, in my case, technicians who would kind of help me develop in those early tours. And of course, you've got your chain of command as well. And part of their remit was always, and part of my remit was always to look after the morale, the people component. So that was something that was always there, naturally built into the structure, and something that I was able to benefit from as I moved up through my career. Yeah, there came a point, and we'll probably talk about it a little bit later, but there came a point where I realized that as good a time as I'd had, there were some challenges with sustaining that type of career, and certainly sustaining the trajectory that I thought I would have wanted to be on, whilst meeting my ambitions in my personal life. I suppose I'd become a mother, I'd wanted to settle down. So at that point, I had to revisit what I wanted to do now I was a grown up, and think about, what drove me, I suppose. What was it that I wanted to do? And that led me into sustainable aviation, because I think one of the other nice things about being in defence was it was always very mission driven and purpose driven. And I realized that I wanted to find, my sort of mission and purpose for the second half of my career. And there was an opportunity to do that in sustainable aviation, directing programs. So yeah, I guess that's an overview of the journey.
Awesome. I mean, that is something truly inspirational, so much of time spent with Air Force and now, focusing towards sustainability. Since, you are more interested in aviation, so kind of, a good shift from the Air Force military background to the corporate. So, I mean, talking about your shift from, Air Force to corporate life, what were the major differences that you were able to see or experience?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, lots of people do it, right? So when I was coming to leave the Air Force, it was quite funny. The military are very supportive. They recognize that we've as employees of the military, we've been somewhat institutionalized, I suppose. So there's a program available that they called resettlement that helps you kind of prepare what you want to do next and how to get there. I mention it because I found it quite amusing that resettlement is also the term they use for prisoners who are coming out of prison and integrating back into normal life. But I didn't quite feel like I was coming out of prison. I was very ready for the change. I think perhaps some people transitioning out of the military find it difficult because perhaps deep down they're not really ready to leave, but that wasn't the case for me. So I was genuinely excited for my next chapter. I've always enjoyed learning new things, which is what you get from doing different jobs. So that was really appealing to me. And honestly, when I first moved into my role in GKN, a company called GKN Aerospace, where I work in hydrogen systems and research and development, on the one hand, it was completely different. It felt quite liberating, I think, in a way. I didn't, I could choose what clothes I wanted to wear to work for a start, and I didn't have to have my hair in a bun. There's certainly a different, a slightly different culture and feel. But equally, there were lots of things that were similar. It was a team of very professional people with their own specialist skills, all trying their best to work together to achieve something quite challenging, probably with less budget than you'd like to have, less time than you'd like to have, constantly shifting requirements and circumstances and newly evolving risks and threats, and all of those things were all of the same things that I'd experienced in all my different roles in the military. So, and yeah, the sense of camaraderie as well. I think I still found that in the corporate world where we were sort of focused around our goal of building some bricks in the sustainable aviation technology.
Easy. So overall, I mean, of course, there would always be differences in the way things were being operated when you were in Air Force versus coming to the corporate world in terms of, as you mentioned about, the limitations of timelines and budgets. Different
Yeah,
ways of cooking would always be there. How was your experience in the difference of approach, or the interactions with people in corporate, teams in corporate versus working with teams in military and air force,
military.
because there is a different mindset altogether, as I've heard, when people are they're trained to have a different mindset when you're working for defense as opposed to corporate. So how was that shift, or how was the experience of that shift for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it is different, you're right. And I guess my last couple of jobs within the military had been within a procurement and in-service support organization. So I was working primarily with what we call civil servants in the UK, so government employees, but non-military personnel. So perhaps the fact that I'd done that made the shift a little easier because there's certainly a contrast between the way that military people in uniform would operate compared to a civil servant. And then, yes, getting into the corporate world, you're right. I think it was, it's less of a vocation perhaps for some people, but then I think going into the role that I went into, a lot of people were there like me because not because, they were getting the best pay packet in the world necessarily, but because they felt like they could contribute to something meaningful. So, well, it's not as vocational, but I think there was still that sense of purpose within that particular team that I joined. And I think the other thing is very different. I mean, we mentioned in the start about authority, but in the military, there's a very visible and rigid hierarchy. People, literally wear their rank
Mm,
on their shoulders, and that can help you get things done if you need to.
mm,
Albeit, I would say that, the traditional sort of leadership approach of command and control that might work on in a war situation in a battlefield, but it doesn't work, I don't think, in day-to-day operations. So you couldn't really take that authority for granted, but it was there and it was visible that it was something that, you know, you could walk into a room and people would know where you were. I think those hierarchies absolutely exist within industry, but they're less apparent. They're a bit more transparent. And even within job titles, there are a sort of, yeah, there are hierarchies there that it took me a little while to work out, I suppose, where the people's authority sat. And then just learning how to, gain respect and authority, which is something that I feel I'd had to do previously, but I couldn't rely on the fact that I walked into the room and I was the commanding officer. Like that, that wasn't there anymore. So you sort of have to start with the basics of earning trust and respect and getting to know people and getting to know the team and finding out how they all tick and therefore what approaches are going to work best with them to get the most out of them.
Great. So one thing which I have found as a challenge, I've always been into corporate world, so I don't have any experience of, military. But one thing based on the conversation, the interaction so far, and the perception that you have about, people who been working in the military is the level of degree of accountability differs a lot. I mean, in military, what we have seen is if something is assigned to somebody, it has to be done. The person takes full ownership and accountability. You don't
Mm.
need to follow up that much because it is assigned, it has to be done. But when it comes to corporates, that becomes a huge challenge. I mean, there could be people with skills, with experience, having all the authority, having the position, and yet sometimes it is difficult to make them accountable to get things done.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I think there is something about, there's a level of discipline that's drilled into you in the military. There is a level of, it's a phrase I like is, not accepting the standard that you walk past is the standard that you accept. So,
Mm.
striving for high standards and expecting that from everyone around you. And I think that's the challenge in the corporate world versus the military is trying to, tap into how can you get people to take ownership without it being a burden on them? I think when people feel passionate about what they're doing and they feel like they're, able to contribute, generally people will take ownership and accountability without it feeling, yeah, like I say, like a burden or too much of a stressor, I suppose. I think that's one of the tricks of being a leader is how we talk about empowerment, don't we? How can you sort of empower and embolden your team, give them enough freedom of maneuver and enough support at the same time, um, and hold them to account when they need to be, when the standards aren't what they need to be, how can you elevate them up there? And there's lots of different approaches, which isn't always a stick, it's not always a carrot either. So yeah, I think you have to have maybe a few more tools in your toolkit in the corporate environment to deal with the different personalities and leadership challenges that you'll face.
Amazing. One learning that I can extract out of this response is in military, everybody chose to be there. They are already passionate to be there. And that is where, as you mentioned, in corporate, there would be people who are doing whatever is assigned to them, but they may not be passionate about doing those things. So they may not be enjoying, but they're doing it as part of
Yeah.
their professional life and for their livelihood. But when it comes to military, nobody is doing it out of any compulsion. They chose it. They were passionate to do it. And that definitely brings a different level of accountability and ownership because you already are passionate about doing all the activities there. So yeah, I mean, thank you for sharing. That's a great insight. I believe all the leaders who see that as a problem in their teams where they are finding some of the individuals not taking the accountability or ownership, maybe it's time for them to go and talk to them and try and understand that maybe they need to be assigned something else which they are really, really passionate about, which they really like to do, and that
Yeah,
might help elevate the level of accountability and ownership.
absolutely. It's really interesting to reflect on it because I think, in the military, certainly later in maybe early in my career as well. But yes, everybody when they first join wants to be there. After a number of years, people's circumstances change and people's views change, and so you did find people who didn't want to be there, but they couldn't leave if they wanted to because they're they're signed into a notice period. So you did experience that to a degree within the military, but the military would deal with that potentially by moving those people to another job where they were relatively happy. Yeah, so it is a different challenge, you say, in the corporate world, and I think that's, being able to empathize, understand, listen. We say we've got two ears and one mouth, so being able to listen to the team and understand them is a starting point, and helping them, and I think the other thing that we can do as leaders is try and explain why we all need to be passionate about what we're doing, why what we're doing matters, because it is hard sometimes when you're a relatively small part in a big machine, perhaps, or it's hard to see where your very specialist piece of work is going to fit into a bigger picture and have impact. I think being able to translate that for people is is a skill in it, a leadership skill in itself. So one to keep practicing and keep learning about.
Absolutely. One of the concept I read about it. It's a Japanese concept. They call it ikigai. I don't know if you heard about it.
No,
Nice. So yeah, I mean that also relates to the same concept, right? I mean, if you're taking your profession as something which you're passionate about, you will enjoy, you will live longer, you will be happier doing work, and that again will reflect into more of accountability and not have those issues.
yeah.
So coming back to the topic of the podcast, the leaders of impact. So as we reflect on your career, there any one specific contribution that is very close to your heart, the impact that you created that you really enjoyed or maybe was most challenging that you want to talk about?
So yeah, you did give me the opportunity to think about this in advance, and I'm afraid I find this really difficult to think about one thing because there are quite a lot. But I suppose that doesn't sound very humble, does it? But I think when you do think back, it's nice to be able to be given the opportunity to have a conversation like this and think back about the things that we've done. And I would encourage everyone to do that wherever you are in your career, because I think we're so busy running ahead to the next thing. It's sometimes you forget to look back and think about what you've maybe been able to do. So I think for me, like I say, I'm proud to be an engineer, but I've always been very much people first, safety second, and then the operation, the program, the deliverable, whatever it is. I think if you get the people and the safety right, the rest of it will more easily fall into place. Um, in terms of people, I think, having impact and looking back at key achievements, I won't name individuals, but I do think I've had the opportunity to help people get the best out of themselves in roles. I do that as a mentor still. I'm part of a mentoring scheme for women in aviation and aerospace and space. So that's something that I've continued to do outside of work, but I've been lucky to have people help me, so it's been nice to be able to think I've been able to do the same with others. And sometimes that's been tangible in that somebody that has worked for me has gone on to be promoted within the Air Force, and you see them kind of going on to bigger and better things. And of course, I can't take credit for their promotion, but I like to think I played a small part in helping them to realize that ambition. Or it might be where I've had somebody who's been going through particularly difficult times and they've just needed someone to support them to navigate those things that are happening perhaps outside of work to allow them to keep going and perhaps even have work as something of a comfort rather than an additional stressor. So I think those people helping others and is something that I'm proud of, and I like to think that I've been able to do as I've gone through my career and keep learning to be able to keep on doing it. And I think the other side of that, I talked about safety. Um, certainly through the Air Force, really a lot of what I did was around ensuring that aircraft were safe to operate, that they were airworthy, either from a single aircraft point of view where we were very close to the maintenance operations, or more from a looking across a whole fleet of aircraft, making sure that they were safe and mission capable. And that would involve taking calculated risks at times in order to ensure that missions could be completed. And yeah, I definitely don't always get it right, but I've never got it horrendously wrong. And I think knowing that I've back to the bit we talked about before, knowing that some of the small actions that I've taken ultimately resulted in we're part of that end result of an aircraft being able to go and do its mission safely and come back. That's a good achievement. So yeah, so that's a couple. I think now in sustainable aviation, I'm similarly proud of the work that we've been able to do over the last couple of years on hydrogen systems, and not all of it will, or any of it might not even make it to a product, but I think the work that's going on is certainly, it's building the foundations and the building bricks for a potential area of fueling and powering future aviation systems that could negate a lot of the effects of carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and lead to cleaner aviation. And it will be a small part of a bigger solution, but it's very rewarding to feel that hopefully when my nearly 10-year-old daughter is flying around for travel or business in future or whatever she needs to get around the world for, there might be some technology on board that aircraft that means it's not polluting the skies in quite the same way we are now.
Great. Yeah. This is lovely. I mean, both the aspects of people first, helping out people. It's really inspirational and sustainability. This is, as you mentioned, it might be a small solution to a bigger system, but looks like it is going to have probably the biggest impact in longer run. Everybody needs to think about it, be aware of it, and sustainability has to come in a day-to-day practice for a lot of things.
Yes.
Just taking care of a big proportion when it comes to aviation. But I feel in our day-to-day life, if everybody has that awareness, they can take care of small things where they are probably not contributing towards the pollution or usage of some type of materials which might be harmful for our environment. So it's really a great initiative. And I think maybe our education system needs to evolve a little more to bring that kind of awareness right from the childhood.
Yeah, or at least to maintain it through. I think, I even remember as a kid being quite aware of environmental issues. The rainforests were being cut down. We had acid rain and holes in the ozone layer. And actually, it was something I looked back on when I was coming to leave the military, because for a little while I really wanted to be an environmental scientist. And so it was one of the things where I thought, well, I've got all of this experience in aerospace, but I also had this passion for conservation quite early on. Was there a way that I could like mesh those two things? And I think during COVID, certainly in Europe, there was time and funding available to kickstart a lot of these initiatives in the aerospace sector. So I think the challenge now is to certainly on that and in the business side is to maintain enough focus on those whilst the industry is challenged in all sorts of other ways and trying to grow. So it's a real balancing act. But you're right, and some of the folk that I work with will say, I've got an electric vehicle. I'm definitely not perfect, but we try to do our best to be environmentally aware and do our little bit at home. So it's really nice to be able to do a little bit in my job as well at the moment.
Lovely. You mentioned about, outside work, you are trying to help people, specifically women in aviation. You also mentioned not not necessarily those people, but somebody who is going through a tough time. You are available as a mentor to those people. So if somebody who is listening to the podcast, and maybe looking for some sort of guidance or help from you, how can they reach out to you? I mean, do you conduct certain programs, some webinars, or is it more towards a close network that you are doing it right now? Maybe, a little more insight would be helpful for the listeners.
Yeah, of course. So I think I mentioned that I'll go back a little bit before I answer your question. But during my Air Force career, a lot of people would say to me, how does it feel being a minority, woman in engineering? And honestly, I never had a problem with it at all. I used to say, well, I don't have a problem with it, so hopefully nobody else does. And it really didn't impact me early on in my career. But I'll be honest, when I came back from having had my daughter, I did suddenly realize that there were some quite systemic challenges, I suppose. And if you weren't lucky with your timing or your particular boss, then naturally the odds were kind of stacked against you. Um, so Fast forward a few years, I was connected with a woman in the Royal Aeronautical Society. So it's a global professional body and learned organization for anybody who works in aviation, aerospace, or space, which is a pretty broad church. And I became part of a committee in the society aimed at supporting women in the industry and giving women a voice. And one of the things that that committee did a few years ago was help to launch a mentoring platform called Alta. And Alta is effectively like a dating app. I have to say I'm a bit old for having actually used dating apps, but it takes data from its members and essentially pairs them up. So if you can sign up to be a mentor or a mentee or both, you can put in what your goals are and it will match you up. And this was based on academic research that was done by the University of West England in the run up to launching this app. So it's a real data driven app. I've joined that platform and I am a mentor on that platform to women in the industry. Like the woman I mentor at the moment, I've never met in person, but we have regular catch ups on Teams and we just talk through problems that she might be having. I'm also a mentee, so I have my own mentor because I think you always can benefit from learning and wisdom and experience from others who've, you know, gone before you. So that's really helpful and powerful for me. So that's primarily how I do my mentoring at the moment through the Alta mentoring platform. It's, you know, anybody can sign up for free. You could just Google that. I'm pretty sure it's available globally because we definitely have some members in Australia, so people could look at that. And then equally, with people in work, I've, just established relationships, I suppose, again, and trying to support people if they need to. So I think that's for your listeners. Probably check out the Alta mentoring platform. If you're not involved in aerospace, aviation, or space, but you're interested in mentoring, then they could always connect with me on LinkedIn. And through the work of Alta, we've got links into other mentoring organizations if people are interested in seeing what formal schemes are out there. Otherwise, I would just encourage people to seek out a mentor, and it doesn't have to be someone in your workplace. In fact, my mentor I deliberately chose because she had nothing to do with the military, and she'd had quite a different pathway to me. So it's always good to get a fresh perspective.
Awesome. Is there a specific pattern or a specific type of challenges that you've seen coming across multiple times to you where you've been able to help, let's say, a lot of, I mean, I don't know the numbers you've met, but,
Mm,
it could always be a situation where same type of issues or challenges or similar type of issues or challenges are coming across to you. So if there is a pattern that you have been able to help out most of your,
yeah.
mentees, I would love to know a little more about it.
Yeah, no, you're right. Every individual's individual and unique and different, but I think with women, I see a lot of issues around confidence and that imposter syndrome, that feeling of, do I deserve to be here? Everybody else seems more confident, brighter, they seem to know more than me. And also with women, professional women, I see there's quite often a lot of diligence and drive and a wish to prove themselves perhaps over and above their male peers to show that they are just as good. And as a consequence, really sort of almost working themselves into the ground, being on that dangerous side of the stress curve where you can get a bit burned out. And that can lead to a bit of resentment if it's not recognized or, you know, despite putting all of this effort in, they're still not perhaps seeing the promotion or the pay packet that they think would be, that they think they maybe should be getting. So I think there's lots and lots of different things, but I'd say confidence, imposter syndrome, and just that, balancing that need to prove oneself with one's ability and getting a fair recognition for that.
Cool. So is this also to a certain extent can we say it's influenced by the book you mentioned about the authority gap, the kind of issues, especially maybe, women or some even some of the men would feel the same kind of situations depending on the personality, they're treated or
Yeah.
perceived differently. So maybe, if you can throw some more lights around that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I mentioned to you when we spoke prior to this podcast, you asked me to think about any books that I'd recommend, and I've got a couple of others, but one that came to mind was this book called The Authority Gap by an author called Marianne Sieghart. And I have to confess, I listened to it not long after I'd been through my quite challenging period. So I think at the time it really resonated with me. And I mentioned just then, hearing about women who feel underconfident. And I have to say, early in my career, I didn't particularly suffer from that. I did go through a period where my confidence was really knocked. But if anything, I think I suffered on the other hand, in that I was quite forthright and I did come up for some criticism, you know, and perhaps some of it was justified as well, because we all do need to take criticism and feedback on board. But I was maybe too overconfident, almost bordering on arrogant, I suppose. And I think looking back, that was probably my way of trying to fit in with the with everybody else around me, with the sort of culture around me. But in doing so, I was in danger of, not listening as well as I could do, and not taking people um, for their strength. So I sort of went through that and then had this pendulum swing to underconfidence. And now I think I've sort of come out the other side in a relatively happy middle ground, but there's still ups and downs. And the authority gap talked about this. It talked about how, as women, and like you say, I think this isn't just a women thing. This could be if you're introverted, if you're from another minority group, um, you can get if you're too quiet, then you can get judged as being underconfident, and underconfidence can get conflated with capability and competence. And so you get judged as, well, they're quiet, they're ineffective, they're not competent. And that impacts your confidence. And so there's like a bit of a vicious circle there. On the other hand, as a woman, if you are quite outspoken and speak up for what you believe in, then you can get branded emotional, difficult, bitchy, bossy, all these relatively negative words. So you've kind of got this double bind of how do you tread that path, and why is it perhaps more difficult as a woman or someone who's a bit naturally quiet, or why should it be more difficult if you just because you're not the alpha male stereotype. So yeah, the book um explored that, and gave some like practical tips as well for kind of navigating around that, both from a sort of organizational point of view, public policy point of view, and an individual point of view. And I think for me, just being aware of it actually, and being aware that this was something that's experienced across a lot of different industries. I think Marianne as a journalist, so her book focused a lot on the sort of publishing and creative industries, so quite different to mine, but still similar challenges. So yeah, so when I speak to mentees about these particular issues, I do have some of what I learned in that book in the back of my mind, and a lot of the time for them, just to know that they're not alone in having these feelings is quite a boost, and that there's a way to work around them, and that actually things are getting better as awareness increases. Both, I think I said to you, as a woman, we're not always the most supportive of other women. So actually that's something that we can do, and having conversations like this, and hopefully more people might might become more aware of it, and be able to and change, certainly change the way that they interact and practice their leadership and team working skills. I think we'll start to gradually see cultures to shift and change.
Right. So it is more to do with just being aware of, this is the situation. I mean, people have that kind of perceptions, or people have that conscious, subconscious, unconsciously also sometimes people have that kind of perceptions and judgments should not impact you. You are good as you are. You don't need to be getting impacted by people's judgment. That is what is the biggest learning that can be taken out of that discussion.
I think so. Yeah, I think that's a great way to look at it. Yeah, you've articulated that really, really well. Like I say, we've all got subconscious bias. So I think for being aware of those, trying to be aware of those ourselves, and tackle those, but also as an individual, knowing that people around us will we'll hold that and, try not to let that, as you say, impact us negatively. Um, that's a really good step, I think, to help us all keep moving.
This gap, this authority gap, do you think this has also reduced? I mean, again, this could be a relative, time-based question, but over a period of time, yeah, I think people are being more aware of these kind of situations. They have been trying to create environment where leadership styles are equally valued.
Yeah.
Irrespective of gender, or irrespective of type of personality. There used to be a large gap at some point of time, maybe couple of decades back. But what are your thoughts? Like, has that reduced, or is it just a different perception being created? Yes, you've experienced those things, so you're the best person to answer maybe that.
So it's a great question, and it's difficult to give an answer that, I can't give you an answer other than that of my own experience, and our own experience is quite often, or mine, it's a relatively small bubble, I suppose. But there's a lot of things we've talked about that as we've been talking, I've thought, but actually a lot of what I'm saying, I think it's different for the generations that are coming through. So I think you can absolutely see like the younger generations coming into the workplace, they expect different, they don't necessarily expect to work as many hours as they can in a week and wear that as a badge of honor. I think they have a more rounded expectation around balancing work and life, and all of these things call for different approaches to leadership and team working. And I think awareness is changing. And I have to say, I haven't been, when I was in the military, I was fortunate to be able to do some relatively formal training relatively frequently to keep myself up to speed. And it's not something that I've done since I've left, but I do really make an effort to listen to podcasts like this one that you're doing, and read and just keep up to date with the latest thinking on leadership, because I find it interesting, and we can always learn. And everything that I read that's coming out, particularly out of academic institutions, it sings to me. I think, oh yeah, this is, leadership is really, practices are really changing and evolving and going in the right direction. And I do see some of that being put into practice in the workplace, and that's really encouraging. But I think there are still pockets, where that evolution hasn't taken root yet. And hopefully it is just a matter of time. But I certainly have conversations with my husband, about some of the things that he still, he still feels awkward about as a leader, I think. And he's a, great, I think he's a great leader too, but I know he finds himself in a culture where he thinks it might not be so acceptable to, perhaps put into practice yeah, some of these more humble leadership, I suppose, and follower leadership sort of thinking.
Okay, one last advice, or one good advice that you want to give to all those aspiring leaders who might be facing these kind of situations in their journey, where they see there is still certain gaps in the way everything is presented equally, but in reality that's not how they are experiencing it. So,
Yeah,
quick advice that you would want to give to all those aspiring leaders, irrespective of gender. I know, this is
yeah.
something that experienced by different people.
Oh, it's hard to nail it down to one bit of advice. But I think, yeah, when you're in the middle of a difficult time, it can be quite hard to remember that you will come out the other side of it, but you absolutely will. And if you are an aspiring leader and you've got an ambition, so you do have to set your sights on that and go after it. So we've talked a lot about, or we've talked around, I suppose, being kind and being humble and all those things you've got behind you, but you've got to work hard there as well and dream big and be positive on your little thing behind you. And I think they are all great bits of advice for aspiring leaders, is maintain that balance of humility and ambition, confidence, but not arrogance, and yeah, set your sights on where you want to get to, go after it. Don't be afraid to change direction if another door opens.
Lovely. I am sure this advice is definitely going to inspire a lot of those aspiring leaders if they would be listening to this podcast, and they will be able to resonate and learn from this. And if at all they feel they need more guidance, you've already specified the platform where they can go ahead, sign up and find you as a mentor. Of course, as part of the podcast, they'll be able to get the LinkedIn profile of yours as well. So if they want to connect directly with you, they'll be able to do so. Thank you so much for taking out time, sharing all the stories of your journey so far, your insight, and great advice for all those people who are aspiring to be leader in coming times. So it was an amazing experience having you on the podcast, Christy.
No, thank you, Beckham. Thank you for the opportunity. Like I said, it's always a privilege to be able to just take stock and reflect. And I've still got lots of learning to do, but it's really nice just to be able to share some of my experiences with you. And I do hope it resonates with a few people and is interesting at least. So thank you for being such a great host.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Take care, Christine.
You too.
Bye.
Bye bye.